Hey everyone, I'm Bret Kinsella. I'm founder of Voicebot.ai, and we're here to talk about some news. And that news comes by way of Google and Google Actions in particular. They call them conversational actions now. I didn't get the memo. I still thought they were called Google Actions, but maybe I'm just stuck in 2016. But it's not just me who's going to be talking about this today. I have some guests, and these include Alan Firstenberg, Eric Schwartz, and Mark Tucker. Gentlemen, welcome.
Great to be here.
Yep.
Okay, so Alan, Mark, you guys are known as the two voice devs, a podcast, popular podcast by that name. How many episodes are you guys up to?
We are coming up on our 100th episode next week.
Oh, okay. Well, perfect timing. Everybody go watch or go check out Two Voice Devs and their 100th episode, which I'm sure would be amazing. What do you have planned for it?
Well, in light of this news, that's a really good question, actually.
We might be doing some shuffling around.
Okay, well, perfect. Great idea. All right. So, and then Eric Schwartz is here too, my colleague from Voicebot.ai. But Alan, just introduce yourself really quickly.
So I'm Alan Firstenberg. I am a Google developer expert for the Assistant, which means that I don't work for Google, but I work with them pretty closely on this sort of stuff. I give them feedback on what developers are looking for when it comes to conversational actions and get responses from them and kind of help the developer community in how to use them effectively.
Perfect. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Senior Technical Director at Rain Agency, and I've been doing voice development since 2016. Alexa Champion, Bixby Premier Developer, and I've done a number of Google Action implementations over the years, personally or with the agency.
Perfect. And Eric, what brings you here today?
Yes, I'm the head writer for Voicebot.ai, and I've been writing about this world for a while now, and sort of seeing the evolution that has led Google to make this sort of monumental decision.
Okay, so the big news here today, and that's why we called this impromptu episode of the Voicebot podcast, which we'll also, I guess, co-publish on YouTube for this because I think it'll be interesting. So there's this innocuous blog post that comes out helping developers create meaningful voice interactions with Android. What does that mean? We've had app actions for a while, but if we just look at the content here, what they've decided to do is sunset Google Actions, conversational actions, which they call them now, but the Google Action developer ecosystem. Everything's going to slide under Google or Android. And this has been a long time in coming. In fact, Alan and I were talking about this. It was either at Google I/O 2019, or maybe we caught up about it afterwards. But certainly we were talking about it around Google I/O 19 when you could tell there was a de-emphasis on Google Actions and more of an emphasis around voice being put into Android apps. And that's about the time I think they talked about their forward beta app actions that they wanted to work into that. But what you could tell through the organizational structure is that the Google Home and Google Actions were actually moving under the Android organization, and long-term implications seem to be that it's going to be a feature of Android and not a standalone solution. What say you, Alan?
No, that was it exactly. I think we started seeing this trend a while ago where more and more focus was being put on app actions. And we were seeing fewer and fewer features coming out for the conversational actions. And then within the past 6 to 9 months, we saw a bunch of people who were leaving Google who were involved very deeply with conversational actions, some of which from day one, and just started wondering what was going on here. And I guess it was a year and a half ago now. It was November 2020 when they had an online forum on what was coming, and they promised a bunch of stuff for conversational actions, including updates to how transactions were going to work, how online purchases would be working, and that never materialized. So over time, we really did start to wonder exactly what's going on here.
And it was interesting because in 2021, Google probably spent more in the developer community around sponsoring events and working with influencers and trying to get people interested than they had in the previous 2 years, or maybe the previous several years combined, because they'd always been a little bit arm length about like getting really deep into what you would consider to be sort of standard evangelism steps. They did a lot in the first half of 2021. I saw it taper off a little bit, but then they didn't renew any of the budgets for 2022. So that alone made me think that this was not necessarily going to be a high priority. What are your thoughts on this, Mark?
Well, I just know that the announcements around developers and supporting third-party actions on Google just diminished quite a bit. There was that changeover from Dialogflow and the different versions of Dialogflow to Actions Builder, but that's really the most recent major thing that's been announced, and we just haven't seen that much going on in the community. So it is something that we were kind of watching for, wondering about. We're kind of surprised by today's announcement. We've had a good partnership with Google over the years and are really proud of the Google actions that we've created over time. But this was kind of a surprise, but in some ways not so much.
Yeah, actually, and if you think about it, the introduction of Action Builder would make you consider that maybe they're continuing a long-term vision here, right? Why change if you're going?
Yeah, you would think you would think so, and so maybe at that time they did, and since then they made the decision. I'm not sure, but yeah, that was kind of a surprise because they made that big change and kind of like a retooling for developers, and then nothing.
It's also interesting to note, though, as part of that, is that the Action Builder tool is similar, not identical, but very similar to the Dialogflow CX tool that they announced a few months later and then made general availability just a few months after that. So while there are interesting parallels between the two tools, they're run out of very different departments. Dialogflow is run out of the cloud division. So it was interesting to see that kind of split. And you did kind of wonder, well, why did they create two nearly identical tools and put them in two different departments?
Well, there is that whole thing, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I should give full credit. Maybe we'll be able to do that in the show notes. But there's this old rule of thumb in the software industry that you can determine a software package's or the organization structure behind a software product by looking at the feature layout on whatever the splash page is, right? And you can see like who has power and things like that. And one of the early examples of this was like, for example, Gmail. And it's like you could see like who had influence based on what buttons were where, and like you could figure that out. And the reverse is also true, right? From an organization structure, is that once you have people who are responsible for certain types of things, you can actually see the power dynamic emerge through this. But let me ask Eric a question. Eric, there was this interesting timing of an announcement last week by our good friend Nick Schwab and the Sleelp Jar that they were actually going to end of life or sunset their Google action. And it just happened to be a week before this announcement.
Yeah, it was an amazing coincidence of timing, to the extent that when speaking with Google, I actually asked them if they had given any developers a heads up, because it turns out not. But Nick Schwab and at Sleelp Jar, they basically spent the last year developing their Android app and launched it while simultaneously announcing that they're ending both the Google Action and their Bixby capsule. So. Just because presumably because his understanding of the where Google was going, Nick saw ahead and realized that it's time to get rid of the Google Action and switch to Android if I want to be able to keep operating there. I mean, and his reasoning is exactly the reasoning that Google put out for choosing to sunset Actions, in terms of not getting a lot of traffic, having a lot of trouble getting discovery, and just not seeing the value in supporting a Google Action versus an Android app, or to be honest, something from Amazon or elsewhere. So yeah, that was kind of amazing. But yeah, but I would also know. I mean, to me, what's interesting is that you wouldn't necessarily have thought that Google was going to completely get rid of their Google Actions, because we talk about when they launched the app actions for Android, they also announced better Google Actions, like a streamlined system for developing it, and better smart display tools and things like that. So it seemed like they were wanting to do something with it, even if it wasn't the same thing they wanted with Android. But now it feels more like they've decided that Android can be the umbrella for everything they're doing, which may or may not make people happy in the next year.
Well, my read on this is that in the fall of 2020, they still were very Android, leaning Android, but they weren't at that time thinking of sunsetting Google Actions. Sometime in the second half of 2021, this became a topic for conversation. About this time when a bunch of people left, and then we noticed the beginning of this year, and I think, Alan, that was a really good point that you made. We started seeing people leave, and Brad Abrams being one of the more prominent ones. Now, he went back to Microsoft, and he'd spent many years at Microsoft before Google, so that's maybe not that unusual, because he'd maintained a relationship with that community there. He's written a book on .NET frameworks. It was very popular. So but he also was essentially the lead engineer for Google Assistant for many years. And he was the one who was most active that I saw on the Google side with the developer community.
Yeah. Hey, Brett, I wanted to bring up something where we're still talking about Nick. I watched a presentation Nick did probably 2.5 years ago up in Seattle. We were all there for, I think, an Alexa thing, and a number of champions got together, and he did a presentation talking about how his ambient sounds, kind of like some of the back end stuff and all the processing that he had to do for hosting, the continuous play audio for hours at a time. And he alluded to just kind of percentage wise, and I don't remember what the exact percentage was, is like just comparison to how many users he had on Alexa versus how many users he had on Google, but it was significantly less on Google, even at that time. So it's just been kind of, I think, this progression of that over time where Nick finally got to a point where he saw that it really wasn't beneficial, and it would be more beneficial to try something with the app actions and Android app.
Yeah, and I think there's a good argument there to say that there's wider reach, and that's been one of the problems with the voice assistant ecosystems, is they just haven't had enough users, right? And maybe there's a problem converting the users that are there. Maybe there's a problem with retention, but it hasn't expanded enough. And even like our data, which I probably should have had some charts for us. We can share those online sometime. But you're talking about somewhere around half of the people that have smart speakers actually use third-party apps, or at least know they're using third-party apps and can tell you this. And so that's not a lot. And most of them are using somewhere around 2 of them per month. So it's like around a monthly active basis. So it's not a lot. And in fact, it's almost like this type of thing where they get the device and, we saw this actually in the Amazon data. And I have no reason to believe that the Google data would be any different than this, even though maybe at a much smaller user base, that within the first 6 hours, users discover over 50% of all of the features they will ever use on the device.
That doesn't surprise me.
Fair enough. Okay, so we have I want to go back to this idea of reach, but let's just talk about some of the things that they have. So first of all, in the announcement, they've got this idea about app actions, and they want to send everybody over to start using that. So that's the key guide. They're using this as a way, not just to say they're sunsetting something, but make a positive out of it. We're actually promoting app actions, which we're expanding, and we're going to give you a nice transition if you are a Google Action developer. We'll also look at this idea that an exception to this. So let me step back. On Google Assistant, essentially the only thing that's going to be left of Google Assistant on smart speakers and smart displays are first-party actions, things that Google Assistant has natively embedded in it. There's going to be smart home, which is one of the big exception carve outs. And there's going to be some of these media things we'll talk in a moment. So one of the things they're saying is if you have a smart speaker that's Google Assistant enabled, you will not be losing out on smart home functionality. And I think there's solid reasoning there. They probably just looked at their data. What are people using this for? Timers, first party. Alarms, first party. Search, first party. What's next? Smart home. Oh, well, that's some first party, but mostly second party or third party. So we should protect that.
Well, I think it's also important to note that with Matter coming later this year, they needed some devices that are going to be supporting Matter as a hub. And they've already announced that all existing Google Home devices from the original Google Home on up will be supporting Matter. That was one of the announcements they made at I/O. So to then a month later say, well, not really, would come across really, really poorly.
I don't know that that's ever stopped them from making an announcement.
That's true, but but regardless, they needed a hub to be able to run the Matter protocol on, because Matter requires a local hub. And they've chosen these devices as their hub, just like Apple has chosen the HomePod for their hub. And, Amazon has all of the Alexa devices or the Echo devices.
Right.
Google needed a device.
Okay. So let's put a hold on that comment, because I want to come back to it in just 1 second. The other exception is actions from web content. So they've had these types of things where you can generate actions from your web content. So essentially, Google can reach in and grab stuff, and you can talk about what that is. But there's another one that's actually more important, in which they made a point of to Eric and I when we were talking about them in the pre-briefing on Friday, that media actions. So there's a certain number of actions, like Netflix, like Spotify, which are not actually conversational actions. Or at least third-party conversational actions. Netflix and Spotify never built these things. They were enabled by Google. So essentially, they're first-party actions that just hit a web service that happens to be Spotify or Netflix in order to enable that user experience. So they pointed out that there are some communications things, which I think is phone calling. I don't know what else. I mean, Duo, but that's still first or second party, depending on your definition. Maybe there's some others from communications, but they're really focused on this media piece and smart home as being the exceptions. And so let's just talk about what the implication here is. Google Home just lost a lot of functionality will in 12 months. But before that, because we have another thing in here, they're going to be shutting down the console. So I think after September, who's going to be supporting their actions without the developer analytics console? So within 3 months, I think most of the stuff is going away, and they essentially just gave up on a significant feature set. Even if people weren't using it a lot, it's like at least they had the potential to be beneficial to them. I don't know. What are your thoughts, folks?
I mean, in addition to those, they've also recently announced that they're shutting down anything that was location service based on smart displays. So Life 360 and Google Maps, you used to be able to say, where is somebody? And it would be able to tell you and show you. That's being shut down as well as a first party like action. So yeah, it still is confusing to me that they're leaving in these little crumbs and yet taking away huge chunks of functionality. I think one of the interesting things, though, is that anybody who previously would have said, and maybe this is why they're kind of thinking this way, is anybody who previously would have said, well, I can build an Alexa skill, and building a Google Home action isn't too hard. There are tools out there that'll let me build for both.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that now. You're literally, you either have to choose that you're going to build an app or an Alexa skill. And the other kicker, though, is at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, they just announced something called App Intense, which look shockingly like app actions. So now Google has essentially said, okay, we're not going to compete with Alexa. Instead, we're going to compete with Apple, which,
it's just another avenue where they're competing with where Apple and Google are competing again, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting from our perspective, because I've got the Rain agency perspective, and I've got the personal developer. I've created cross-platform applications, voice experiences using Jovo, and it's not that much of a lift to develop for both Google and Alexa, and Bixby for that matter. And those tools, like Jovo originally was created to handle both of those things, Alexa and Google, but now it's really only going to be targeted towards Alexa as far as the big platforms, but Jovo's evolved as well, and you can create custom assistants and things like that, and that's kind of parallels what we're seeing on the agency side of things too. So we're not going to see any new actions built. And I'm assuming, and anything that other agencies we're seeing as far as current contracts to build Google Actions, I don't know that that's really going to go anywhere. So now it's going to turn to, well, do you want us to create an Android app or an app action for you, or Siri shortcuts if you're doing that, or if you don't have Alexa skill, do that, or create a custom assistant. So we still have things that we need to talk to our customers and potential clients about as far as things to do, but we're just not going to see that in the area of conversational actions. The voice experience, the voice apps are going to go into these other areas.
Well, let me just ask this question. You guys are the experts here. So conversational actions, you can see it on here. It's going to be deprecated on June 13th, 2023. The way it was positioned to Eric and I when we were talking to Google executives was that we're going to help all these folks transition. We're giving them a full year. And yet in the change log, there's this second bullet point that says the Action Console analytics will be deprecated in 3 months. So isn't that really when everything ends? Like, is anybody going to keep these things live without that?
Maybe. Well, for starters, there's always the question: is anybody going to keep these alive at all? I think the deprecating the console analytics for a lot of people is not really a huge deal, because everyone was doing analytics separately anyway. If you were supporting actions and skills, and if you were supporting actions, you were almost certainly supporting skills, you had a separate analytics package that you were using, because having to go to two consoles didn't make any sense. On the other hand, that's also a good way to kind of hide the fact that nobody was ever using your action. So I don't think it's going to make a huge deal, but it'll certainly make some.
It could also just be a nudge for the people who are procrastinating, finishing whatever. If they want to do a transition or make an Android app, can help nudge them that they're running out of time.
And maybe I kind of want to pick up on that. Will help people transition. Transition to what?
Yeah. I think
it's a completely different programming language. It's a different approach. It's not like, here's this migration kit that's going to convert my conversational action to an Android app with app
exactly.
actions.
I suspect they're thinking of those who either have some sort of Android app that could be augmented with the Google action. Like there's the people who like Sleelp Jar, where it's like the only difference is that it's an Android app versus just a Google action. So the transition, quote unquote, is having an Android app. And then there's those who are, maybe they don't want to keep supporting, maybe they don't want an Android app, so they have to figure out something else if they do have customers who like whatever their Google action is. But I mean, I think there's a polite fiction over it, which is that they're giving you a heads up. But it's like, they got rid of the template actions. When was that? Near the end of 2020. And that was like really like the playground for just like people who were interested in voice and wanted to try stuff out. And then they got rid of that. And it was like, they talked about it being a quality thing, and they were getting rid of all these, either kind of potentially scam actions or just like things that didn't work and all those other things. They were really aiming for, like, as they put it, aiming for like a quality thing. But it does feel like they're they'll put the polite, they'll be polite about it, but they're basically saying, this is what we envision for our voice ecosystem, and you can either create something that fits within it, or just, you won't be a part of it because it won't fit with what we're trying to do as we go from competing with Amazon to competing with Apple. Apparently, as you point out, it certainly seems like where they're going.
Well, let's be clear here, and I'll let Mark and Ellen, you guys could debate this with me, but it is more complicated to build a mobile app. It's more overhead, more costly, different skill sets to build that than to do a Google action.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think you're missing one other thing, is that app actions today are missing features that are in Google Assistant. And to build those features in, if an app wanted to provide additional audio feedback or make something a little more conversational, that's now a lot of additional development that goes into it.
So is the argument that the trend's going away from conversational and more to voice commands?
Well, I think, and again, Bret can quote the numbers on this. I think there's ample history to show that's true.
Yeah.
But I think and I do think it's true, and I do think that's how most people want to use it. But I think where it falls short is in cases where you do need an additional round trip. So if I, to give an example that Google likes to give a lot is MyFitnessPal, for example. You could say things like, record that I just ate a banana, which works well if it heard the fact that you actually ate a banana and you didn't eat, a hot dog, which it's been known to do. Currently, the app doesn't give you that audio feedback. It launches you onto a page that shows you a bunch of data and expects you to look at that page and press the submit button. It's a complete, and if you wanted to build something where just audibly it would say, okay, I've recorded that you ate a banana, that's a lot of additional work that you now need to put in as a developer.
So and it also seems to go away from the completely hands-off. One of the things that I really like about voice is just the fact that I'm doing something, I think about it, I say it, it's done, and I don't necessarily have to break my stride. I don't have to stop and look at a screen now, and if I don't want to, or be forced into a touch action when I'm really wanting to do the whole thing with my voice.
Right, and they're supporting some of that in some ways using the widget support. So widgets, which are part of app actions, can show a widget as part of the assistant, and there can be some text to speech that comes back with that. So there's a little bit of support there. If you have a widget, which I don't know many Android apps that do have widgets in the first place, and you're willing to put in this extra coding to handle it, then you have these additional features. But again, it's additional work that maybe eventually you'll get to, but it's not so straightforward up front.
I was wondering, related to that, they made a big deal about the app actions for Android, about making it very much across different platforms in terms of wearables and cars and everything like that. And maybe that is part of their strategy, where it's, if they move it away from the pure smart speaker, smart display software, and now make it say that, oh, it's for your phone and your watch and your car, etc. So then it's extra work, but it applies to more I guess outlets or ways that, or places that people might use it. I wonder, do you think that that's their way to encourage people by saying that it's, when you're getting an Android app, you're also getting it for every other potential Android platform?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it could open it up to more platforms, but the assistant ran on Wear OS, and the assistant worked on Android Auto beforehand. And now that they've opened up the assistant into these two additional platforms, they've limited exactly which skill invocations and what will work on those. So for example, right now you can only have their built-in intents that directly apply to the auto on auto. And you can only have built-in intents that directly apply to exercise on Wear OS. So instead of broadening it, they've narrowed it on these platforms, at least initially. We could see how that changes over time, and hopefully it will. But in opening up app actions to these platforms, they're very timidly opening it up.
So let me bring something up. This is going to be germane here. So improving voice forward experiences. Now, for a long time, I've been thinking, or I've been wary of the multimodal future of voice assistance and voice interaction, because it was sold as it's going to enhance the experience. But time and time again, what we see is it enhances the experience in some contexts, but in other contexts, it eliminates the experience because you have to actually then use a screen. You can't actually do it. So, but just related to this type of thing. So they've got a section in their blog post that says, "Oh, improving voice forward experiences. This is good for you, Google Action developer." So you're going to be able to work across all these other platforms, which, as we've talked about, you could already work across, but okay, fine. Bringing more traffic without more development work. Okay. So let's break that down. Bringing more traffic. They are going to enable something where if you ask Google Assistant something on the smartphone, you won't have to actually mention the app name. If it has Google Assistant functionality like app actions built in, it might surface that for you, right? And it might surface that for you even if you don't have that app installed. And it would somehow, it's not clear to me whether it's suggested and then you do a voice command to accept it, or you have to click on something, but somehow it's going to suggest Android apps that have voice capabilities. And so this sounds like free discovery, and everywhere else you have to pay for app download position in any of these types of things. What do you make of this?
I think it's just as you said. I don't know what it's going to mean going forward. It certainly means that the first apps who incorporate it will get a first mover advantage. But when there are dozens or hundreds of apps that have this enabled, that have enabled the same built-in intent to start a run, which one is it going to pick to recommend to you? And how does it do that? And those questions were not answered previously, and they're not answered now. So I definitely think, it's encouraging developers to do it now, because you could get in before anybody else does. But we'll see how it scales. I am not optimistic about how well it scales.
I've heard that promise though too. Like when Alexa came out or Google came out as well, it's like, get out here first so you get your first advantage. And Google's different in the fact that each of the invocation names need to be unique. With Alexa you still have the option, the challenge where they could be different. But if we're trying to get away from those invocation names anyway, and we're trying to do what are the built-in intents that will start these experiences up, then once you get, I'd say 2 or 3 or more, then you start getting collisions, and then you either get inundated with choices, or you get the ones that are most popular bubbled up to the top anyway.
Well,
you don't really have an advantage.
You don't have canonical naming in Android apps, is my understanding.
I don't think so. No.
Right. So that the uniqueness there is gone, and conversational actions are gone. So there is no more unique naming. So anybody who got that great conversational action name, too bad, it's gone. It's doesn't exist. Certainly 12 months from now, but soon. I'm interested though in this other thing, which I think is just interesting because it seems disingenuous to me. Bringing more traffic without more development work. And I think we just said that's not wrong, or that's not right. It is wrong. There is more development work. It might be that once you've done all of the additional work, there's not additional development work to get free referrals.
So I think what it means in this case is, the additional development work to make it so that your app can be launched by voice is pretty low. It's it's a couple of additional fields in an XML file.
Yes.
It is not a lot additional that needs to be done. And none of it is code. It's all a configuration file. So it's not wrong. How right it is, again, is another question.
I think it is wrong. I think it is wrong that because this blog post was not to all developers. This blog post was really to conversational developers. This was Google Home, Google Assistant developers. And there's more work. You have to create an Android app, and that's not trivial. It's probably an order of magnitude more complex than what you've already created in the action world.
Yeah, I think so. I think the phrase in here that always gets me is you can offer deeper voice experiences. Now,
it's not true.
I don't know what a deeper voice experience is, but when I think of a deeper voice, I think of a conversation, which is what they're getting rid of.
Yes.
Well, because you have different types of apps, right? You've got I want to say something and just have it get done, kind of the command side of things. There's data entry, there's search, which is another option. But when it gets more complicated than just a single command, even when it's filling in forms or filling in values, I want to schedule, reserve a hotel room or something, you might have different things that you say and different things you fill in, and it's kind of like, okay, well, what's this one? Or I've overfilled, or I haven't filled in enough slots yet, so I've got to keep asking for that. And there's this conversation back and forth, and I don't see that being what's going to be offered in the app action world in the near term.
Yeah, so there's a category of conversational Google Actions, conversational interactions that are going to go away essentially on the platform. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. All right, so I do want to come back to this conversation about the smart speakers. It drives me nuts. I just okay, did you just decide you don't care about this platform anymore? And I'm trying to think about this strategically. Well, they're working with Matter. They have Nest. They have all these smart home devices, right? And certainly those smart home devices, that whole market exists without smart speakers. There's no question about it. But I just did some research on this, and we've got something coming out later this week, I believe. 80% of smart speaker owners own at least one smart home device. There's huge overlap between the two. And if you don't own a smart speaker, only 45% of consumers own smart home devices. It's like a big, big difference. So, I think Pete Erickson said, hey, maybe this announcement is just an acknowledgement that they lost the smart speaker and the smart home, the smart display battleground. I mean, I put something up here in response to someone else's tweet that, essentially they acknowledged that the amount of third-party Google Actions being used were immaterial. Now, Mark, you just mentioned the presentation that you saw in Seattle that indicated this. And, I put in this thing, a Google Action dev should be able to confirm that. And I've seen some of the data myself, but let's see what, Daniel Mittendorf immediately responds, oh yeah, it's between 0.5 and 1%. So it's 2 orders of magnitude more on Alexa than it is with Google Action. And I believe, and Eric was probably taking better notes than I was during our discussion with Google folks. I said, are you just saying that the number of third-party or the amount of third-party app usage on smart speakers is immaterial? And so nobody's really going to notice. It's not going to be a sacrifice. It's not going to meaningfully change the value of the smart speakers and smart displays. And the response was, yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, they basically did seem to, they implied that anyone who has a Google Action that does bring in enough use and volume of users as to be important, they will also be ones who will build their own Android app, they're going to take those steps, but the vast majority, it's not relevant for their business or their activities at all. I do wonder a little bit how much of this is a branding thing, though, because it does feel like they want, instead of feeling like they're competing with Amazon in a voice assistant matchup that they might be losing, if they turn it into a Android versus iOS or any other Apple thing, then it becomes a much more even fight, or at least a fight that they can claim to be winning in some contexts, as opposed to purely based on smart speaker skills and actions, where it has for a while felt like they're sort of treading water and really not keeping up at all.
That is a really good point, because now they're fighting against someone who is determined to lose the voice platform wars.
I don't know. They seem pretty determined to lose. I mean, so it's the two top. I mean, it's in a way, it almost looks like, okay, so now we've got two companies who are chasing after Amazon again, just like in the cloud space, we have two companies chasing after Amazon, which is not what anybody expected. I think Apple is determined to lose voice, and I think Google has said, well, if Apple is determined to lose voice, so are we.
Or at least, accentuate voice on mobile with Siri shortcuts and app actions. They seem to be aligning more on the same approach.
Yeah.
And maybe that's they're playing to their strengths. If there was a Fire phone from Amazon that had any significant market share, and had grown at that point in time when they tried it out, then maybe Amazon would be doing something similar. But not to say that Amazon's not also accentuating their send a phone or any of their mobile voice tie-ins that they've got. So they're also focusing on that same type of interaction.
Oh, sure.
As a possibility too, but it's just they're just not throwing everything else away.
Well, I think as we've seen a couple of people discussing this on Twitter already, people asking, well, what does this mean for Alexa? And I think it's pretty solidifies that Alexa is going to be around, because Google is saying, well, we have Android as a platform, and Apple saying we have iOS as a platform, and Amazon is saying, right, we have Alexa as a platform. So, I think Alexa becomes the platform that happened to start out voice first, and where it goes is going to be the big question.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And I am interested in this. I could see a scenario where Amazon takes this as a way to pull back. And that was one of the comments that I saw on Twitter. It's like, oh, does this mean that like Amazon's going to feel like they don't have competition, and then they're going to invest less because they now own it? I don't think that's the way Amazon operates. I think the market signal that either they will ignore the market signal and just do what they're going to do anyway, which is largely what they do, or they will look at this and say, oh, wait a second, I can really press my advantage here. I already have an advantage, market share advantage in many markets, not all of them, but in many markets for smart speakers and smart displays. That is real estate in the home that I found to be very valuable. It ties in really nicely with my media and my shopping businesses, which are very important to me. And so maybe I double down. Maybe I expand this. Maybe I really say, hey, there's a skill for that. Like, there's an app for that. Advertising, this was a problem that we've always faced in the voice first space, is that there's never been enough national advertising. There's been national advertising about a few things, but usually it's been around first party stuff, not that much around third party. But this idea of really emphasizing this, trying to get maybe a renewed interest in it, and then just making it a fait accompli that anytime anyone goes to the store or online to think about buying smart home or smart speakers, specifically smart displays, they're like, oh, geez, like it's a complete imbalance in terms of the different offerings out there. I guess I have to go with the Alexa ecosystem. It's the only one that really cares.
Yeah, I think it's telling that the sort of generic term for a voice assistant has largely become Alexa, and meanwhile, Google has not so recently, but I remember there was a period where they were making all this effort to turn their Android mobile devices, to give them an option to essentially turn into smart displays, where you just like flip them over and plug them in and suddenly add a smart display. And it's approaching the same concept from different directions and recognizing where their strengths are. And also the element from the Amazon side was that Jeff Bezos was such an advocate of Alexa in all its forms that things that might have been failures and led to a reduction in resources never happened there. Whereas with Google Assistant, I suspect there was more of a turf war, executive fighting over resources and what they're going to focus on next, and how they want to present their world of tech, essentially.
Turf wars at Google? No. Ellen's surprisingly quiet on that.
I don't work for Google, so I have
But
no insight what goes on inside the company.
Come on, you know a lot about what goes on inside the company. You've seen it. We all it's not hard to see because it spills over into the general media press and just have conversations with people.
Right. I mean, as a GDE, I usually see it when they kill whatever GDE I am at that moment. So yeah.
Well, this is true. So I think you offered, this is a special offer to anybody watching today. Are there any Google programs that you would really like to kill? Because Alan has a particular skill in this area. I think you told me this is your third technology platform where you've been a GDE, Google Developer Expert, that has announced being end of life.
Yes, this will be my third after Google Plus and Google Glass.
Yeah, you know how to pick them. So is this a function of you, or is this a function of Google? And I don't know how.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I like to think about the fact that all three of these technologies have been kind of leading out there. They've been kind of pushing the boundary on stuff. Google Plus was trying to push the boundary on social and on technology integration inside Google. Mm-hmm. And Glass was trying to push was an early generation of the Google Assistant, really. Yeah. And Google Assistant was, again, trying to push what we mean when we talk about interfaces and how we interact with our computers.
Okay, Glass was first to market, we'll call it. Google Plus was a follow-on. Google Assistant was a follow-on in the market. Certainly, maybe the second generation follow-on, even with Google Assistant. But they all were positioned as maybe the most ambitious of their category.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the problem.
That Google is too ambitious and it needs to be less ambitious?
No, or that you just align yourself with those projects that are more ambitious.
That could be.
You find them more interesting.
That very much could be.
Okay, so how many other GDEs are you, what else are you a GDE for?
I am also a GDE for their identity platform, which I don't anticipate going anywhere. And for Workspace, which I don't anticipate going anywhere. And for wearables,
not going anywhere in terms of expansion,
no. As in, they're not going to shut the door on it next.
And wearables. Oh, so wearables, you would think is going to stick around, given how much money they spent on at least the Fitbit acquisition. But we'll see.
But you would have expected the same thing on Glass, but that's another story.
Well, that reminds me of my short stint developing applications for Windows Phone. That was there and then gone. So now that's happening with Google Assistant, because I started back in 2016. So just that same year is when Actions came out, and now they're going to be gone. So what's the equivalent of a Scaramucci in the voice app space?
That's a reference that's going to go over the head of most of the people watching this, but I got it. Okay, so we can talk about other things if you want, but I did want to just talk about one more topic. So we started talking about this idea of what this means for Amazon going forward. And let's talk about it in the context of, let's say, what it means with Amazon and what it means for users going forward. And Mr. Alexa Champion, Mark Tucker, why don't we start with you?
So what is this going to mean? I think Amazon's just going to keep going forward. They've got Alexa Live coming out here in just a few weeks. There's going to be a number of announcements that are developer focused. So the things that we get announced now will be things that, as developers will see probably coming available to us in preview form in 6 to 8 months. We've got those things that they announced last year that are coming out now, things like send to phone. So I think they're going to just continue to go forward. I think there's a lot of things that they've worked on Amazon that have treaded new ground, and they'll continue on those things. Like started out with Alexa for Business, Alexa for Hospitality. I think they're going to go ahead and continue on doing things for the smart speaker and smart display, but also ways to tie in with your phone. So I think there's still going to be a healthy ecosystem for voice development. And then also along the healthcare, HIPAA compliant environment stuff. They've got a story where nobody else has a story.
Fair enough. All right, Alan.
The biggest thing that I like to for starters, I think this is going to be a huge win for Alexa users. Certainly, I think we're going to see people whose budgets were saying, "Well, if I've got to do it for both, I don't know." Now saying, "Well, there's only one game in town, and I'll play it." And I think it's going to be good for Alexa. I think my biggest concern is in the longer term, what it means for the ecosystem. Alexa was kind of stagnant 2 years in until Google said, we're going to compete against them. And then suddenly Alexa started saying, oh, we're going to improve our developer experience and the developer console will get a revamp. And we're now going to build tools that look shockingly like Google's and like Dialogflow. And we're going to make it easier for developers with conversations. And without that, I am worried that without that pressure, they're going to cruise. Or maybe they're going to say, well, we have this platform and everyone else is on mobile. And if we don't do something on mobile, we're going to get crushed. So they're going to have to focus more of their resources on mobile. And I don't know if they can do it there because the two dominant players are, the dominant players.
Well, and then that is a challenge for the people that we work with. Our customers are talking about, we've partnered with Google on this and now they're going away, or we're partnering with Amazon. So is it time for us to give serious thought to a custom voice assistant of our own so that we can own the data, own the whole thing end to end, and the tools are only improving in that area to make that possible. So people might skip over, companies and brands might skip over significant expenditures in the area of Alexa and go on to custom assistants. I don't know. That'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think so. Eric, what are your thoughts?
I think that you're right that it's a win for Amazon. I think that it sort of cements even further that when people think of voice apps, they're going to go to Amazon before anywhere else. I think that Google's strategy of essentially making voice purely an extension of Android makes sense for them, but it also feels like something they should have been doing a few years ago, because now it feels like they've scattered their branding and their resources a bit too much. It's not that it's impossible for them to turn this into like a winning move, but I think it's going to be tricky when people think of Android purely as like, maybe they think of it for their car or even for their wearables, but they don't necessarily think of it as their voice interface, and developers don't necessarily make sure to include voice when building your Android app. I think that's going to be their struggle, and they may be able to overcome it and use the fact that that a lot of people have Android devices as a way to get ahead of both Apple and Amazon. But I don't know if it's going to be very easy for them to do so, despite their innate advantages being, Google with a piece of everything.
I think your last point is actually a big one, and that's, will they be able to get Android developers to think about voice as opposed to getting voice developers to think about Android? And I realize we just shifted the topic back to away from Alexa, but I think the tie-in there is, alternately, this is the moment where Amazon could say to Android developers, here's the Alexa integration kit for your app. And preempt Google there.
Yeah, if they come up with something like that where they say, here, install this and it turns your Google action into an Alexa app, then I think they're going to get a lot of converts very quickly.
And not only that, you can send a phone to both Android and iOS. So you can now tackle two mobile app platforms with one voice integration. That's a win.
I think that's a key one. I will say that a couple things occur to me that seem likely, and particularly from the perspective of the people outside of the big tech companies. So we'll talk about the key players here: the independent developers, the brands, and the users. First of all, if people think that they just saw a demonstration of how powerful it is to have your own assistant on the front end from what they saw of the benefits that were accrued to Amazon and Google, they will go to that custom assistant, as Mark was talking about, because you can't get a rug pull if it's your own platform. And there is always that big risk that the platform will basically take all of the time and investment that you have done to sort of build something useful for your business and just make it worthless in a matter of moments. And that's always sad, but it is true. I think it also means that voice as a channel is probably going away. So this idea that we had these ecosystems of voice apps and they had access to lots of consumers. And if you put your brand in those channels, you'll get this discovery benefit, engagement, maybe ROI off of it. I think that's going to go away. Amazon and Google weren't really executing on that well anyway. And I think part of the calculus here for Google was that most of the independent developers will just give up. Abandon. But some of the brands will move over to apps, and it'll be like an incentive maybe for brands to be in the app ecosystem, which is what they really care about. I don't think they really care about the independent developers in the voice space right now, because they're not bringing a lot of activity to the platform. And so from a metric standpoint, they're not that interesting. But I also think that we move away from this idea of voice as a channel, we're also moving away from this idea that brands are going to prioritize it because they're not missing out on reach, because anyone in the marketing department cares about this reach and frequency mechanism that they use for advertising. So I think from that perspective, there's going to be a lot of people who are just going to say, oh, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Unless Amazon really starts to invest in ways that they haven't in the past to make this, particularly with discovery and some of the retention types of things, to make it really worthwhile for some of the brands. All those things I think are interesting. And the other thing I think from an Amazon standpoint, what they should do, and what I'm sort of 50-50 on whether they'll do or not, is they should just double down on the home. Forget about you can do some stuff on mobile, and they should have a better mobile strategy on this. And I think there's certain things that they can do. But if they own the home, they're going to own a lot of daily habits. Yeah. And if they own a lot of those daily habits, they will be able to overcome the friction of not having the native voice assistant on the mobile OS. They'll get more people using mobile. And one of the key things that they haven't really done to date, but they're working on it, they've got some inroads into it, is the television, which is another area, which I think is going to be that much harder for Amazon to own, or for Google to own, that much harder for all these other people to own, just because they actually have this infrastructure and this ecosystem inside the home, and they've got third-party developers ultimately that I think will support what they're doing.
And I'd point out that although Google has hinted at more assistant integration on their television product, it's not there yet. It wasn't announced at I/O. It's only hinted at the announcement today.
When you think about the command and control, and we talked about command and control too, which is the other trend that I think is going to be here. That once you take Google Assistant into more command and control, and I will say that the Google executives we talked to were very specific about the fact that they still consider it an assistant, because I said, well, okay, I understand what you're doing. Business decision makes sense to me. I understand why you might decide that. And I understand how App Actions works. So are you looking at Google Assistant more as a voice UI going forward than as an actual assistant? Oh, no. We're still an assistant. Well, to a certain extent, that's true to the extent you have an assistant with first-party services associated with it, right? So there's assistant-like functionality, but all the implementations, and you mentioned earlier, Alan, you said, hey, I probably have data on this. Yeah, 9 of the top 10 use cases on smart speakers, forget about smartphones for a moment, but on smart speakers are basically command and control interfaces. It's single shot, right? There's only one of them that you would expect there to be multi-turn. On the phone, it's comparable. I think it's 8 to 10 or something like that off the top of my head. I don't recall, but that's what people are using. I think we're just going to see more of it because nobody really has a big incentive to create something beyond command and control. And that could be okay as well, because I think we should have gone to that step before the assistant. And that's sort of what Siri was doing, was really more command and control. It was basically a voice UI for applications that already existed. It wasn't trying to do a conversation, with a few exceptions. And then Alexa came out and just like blew that thing up before we actually had widespread command and control. But those are a couple of thoughts. I think, Mark, you had something you want to say.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, I definitely have the developer hat on, but if we are moving more to command and control and away from conversational, then that affects a whole industry of conversational designers. And,
It does.
It doesn't take a lot to do, the command and control, voice user interface, as opposed to more of a conversation and interactivity. So that would be
a great point.
Yeah, what I think though is we will see command and control will work well in a bunch of cases, and then over time we will start to see the limitations of it, and then need to figure out how we're digging our way out of that hole.
Yeah, and at that point too, when you regress like that, it's not clear that you do dig out of the hole. You might just wait for the next thing to come along. But I believe this. The other thing I just saw Andy Bellavia from that a lot of you guys know from the hearables industry.
Yeah.
Was saying, okay, well, now we can get on to like getting an assistant that works across all platforms. And I think that's the optimistic view, is that we always needed an independent voice assistant, which would truly be helpful to us and wasn't just always biasing towards one person's platform services versus another's. And so this may have paved the way for that by really Google stepping back. But I'm not sure. I still think I do believe there will be an independent assistant from some sort of non-tech giant that will come up and will be hugely popular. I'm just not sure that this is the step that's going to get us there. I think we're a couple steps away.
I think my concern on that, and I would be thrilled if there was such a thing, but I think my concern is what form factor does that assistant take? And right now when we talk about third-party assistants, we talk about it kind of vaguely in terms of, well, it's an app on a phone, or it's something embedded in a web page. And I think the beauty of where Alexa started and where Google picked up is the fact that we've got these low-cost devices that we can just put anywhere.
I know, it's amazing.
As opposed to, having to buy a $600 phone to carry around. I could put
which is bad economics.
Right.
Apparently.
So, I know why Google doesn't necessarily want to support the $30 puck, but, as a consumer, the cheap is what got me, is what gets you into it.
And as a developer too, it was less effort. You could do some really interesting things. I mean, some of the most useful voice apps are actually some of the ones that are probably easiest to build, at least initially. All right, hey, let's wrap this up. Eric, any closing thoughts?
No, I would just say that I think it's easy. It's tempting to ascribe like some grand strategy to everything Google's doing, but when we spoke with we spoke with them the other day, their person who's sort of certainly the face of this transition. She's been at Google for 2 years, which is, she's not brand new, but it does indicate that it's an untested shift and something that she and her team were able to convince the higher ups that this is the way to go. And, I don't think.
Well, do we think that's what happened? Do you think they convinced it, or the higher ups told them that this is what?
Honestly, you're right. It could have been both ways, or either that, or they were the higher ups came up with wanting to do this, and they suggested a method that won them over. But I don't think it's not that I think Google Assistant is going anywhere, and I think that there are all these hints of speaking of Rain, talking about like enterprise voice assistants and talking about like it's not talked about a lot, but the hospitality industry is like going in a big way. Every month I see major story, or stories of major contracts for hospitality for hotels that are using Google or its rivals. And I think that the voice assistant isn't going anywhere, but I think that the sort of open experiment and see what works and see if you can make some money from it age is definitely coming to an end for Google, and I think in general. So I don't know what the next stage looks like, but definitely more controlled from above on Google's part.
Mark, your closing thoughts and anything you'd like to promote as well.
Oh, well, I there's plenty of options in voice. I don't think it's going anywhere. And, as a brand or a business, if you're interested in talking what those options are, whether it be a voice strategy or some sort of implementation, it could be on the phone, it could be on the web, it could be a custom hardware, then go ahead and give us a call and we'll talk about that with you and figure out what the way forward is for you. Especially if you have some Google Actions, Rain Agency. You can contact me on Twitter or just look at rain.agency and we'll just contact us and we'll talk with you about it.
Perfect. Alan.
I think despite me being a bit cynical, I am in some ways kind of excited about where this goes. There are a lot of questions that still have to be answered. What is going to happen to all of the Google Home devices? Will they be able to communicate now or in the near future with the assistant on your phone? Is there a strategy that is behind this, and you're pessimistic on that?
Well, I asked these exact questions, and they were like, no.
Well, that's no this week. This is Google. Who knows what's going to come up in a month or two. So right now there are a lot of questions. There are more questions than answers, and I think over time, hopefully, we'll see. Hopefully, some of these answers will work out that I think in ways that are good for consumers and for developers. And when folks want to reach out to me on some of this stuff, you can find me at spiders.com is the company that I work for.
Okay, spiders.com. And we also should promote Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs.
Approaching 100 episodes on your podcast.
Yeah. And I think going forward, we're going to be talking about these questions about where do developers go next? How do we as developers continue to build exciting voice apps on whatever platform?
Fair enough. Well, the one thing I would say in closing is you can't shrink to greatness. You can shrink to survival, but don't expect there to be some explosion in the use of Google Assistant app actions all of a sudden because they're getting rid of the Google Actions. If anything, this is a reduction in the investment. It's a reduction in the surface area for sure. And it's a reduction in the investment. It is likely going to lead to lower performance in sales of their smart home devices across the board, would be my guess, which will lead people to believe they made the right decision and will therefore lead to less investment going forward. That doesn't mean they won't start doing well on the mobile side, which they do need, which is a really meaningful space. But I don't think that if they do well on that side, it will be the result of this. I think it'll be the result of something else. All right, folks. I'm Bret Kinsella, host of the Voicebot Podcast. Thanks again for coming out today. You can find me on the Twitter at Bret Kinsella, and you will find me occasionally agreeing with or sparring with Alan Firstenberg or Mark Tucker, and occasionally with Eric Schwartz too. But we tend to be aligned more often, probably. So check out what we're doing on Twitter, but also on YouTube. We have this new series coming up called 10 Minutes On, which are 10-minute conversations, video on YouTube with people who are making interesting changes, who are involved in new technology in the voice AI community. And that new series is going to be rolling out later this week. You should be able to see new episodes of that coming out every week. Shine a light on some of the innovation in the space. All right. Once again, thank you, Alan, Mark, and Eric. We really appreciate your time today. And this discussion is certainly not over.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Brad. Take care.